we have a rough idea as to what's going on in the economy. And the thing is that a lot of the stuff that matters to Canadians, clean air, clean water, good quality of living, the ability to enjoy leisure time, those things are highly correlated with GDP. So even if it's not perfectly calculated, if it's going up, there's a good indication that our standard of living is probably going up as well. So I don't think that it's the be all and end all of how to figure out what's going on in the macroeconomy. So that's also why I found it somewhat comical that we're debating about technical recessions. And really, you're missing the broader point if that's the debate that you're having.
Today on True Patriot Love, I'm lucky to have Moshe Lander, Senior Lecturer at Concordia University. Good morning.
Hello.
So 11 days left. So this has been an interesting couple weeks in politics. 11 days left. Last week we got the news we're in a technical recession. The Conservative Party was clamoring away. They want the government to stay around, Moshe, and they want to debate and they want to figure out how to get this thing fixed. We're the only country in the G7 that apparently is in a technical recession, according to them. Give me your thoughts.
Oh, I have so many. So if you look at the debate around a technical recession or not, it almost seems like it's missing the point. Like, who cares if we're in a technical recession or not? I think what Canadians want to know is my standard of living improving or getting worse? And I think there's no question that most Canadians will say that their standard of living is getting worse. So what difference does it make if we decide that, oh, no, never mind, we weren't in a recession after all? The average Canadian is going to say, that doesn't really change my life a whole lot. And so, I hate the word, but the kids these days are using the word me-cession. And so the idea of the me-cession is that if I tell you that the economy is growing, but somebody looks around them and says, I don't have a job, my family don't have jobs, my friends don't have jobs, then it really doesn't matter that I'm saying that the economy is growing. And the reverse would be true as well, that even if we accept we're in a technical recession, if you have a job or your friends have jobs or your family have jobs, you're going to say, how does this affect my life? And so I think that the micro is much more important. And what's really clear is that the standard of living in Canada has deteriorated. But where Pierre Poilievre would tell you that this is 10 years of liberal rule, it's actually 35 years in which this has been happening. And that spans both conservatives and liberals that are responsible for the mess in which we find ourselves. You can only blame so much on Trump, and I'm certainly willing to put him near the top of the list for the recent events. But this is something that's been going on for a long time now, and it's really homemade.
I want to step back for a minute and, really learn from you about GDP, because a lot of times we throw around GDP as a marker of the economy and a benchmark. And, as when I was going through my economics classes at U of T, they called it a basket of goods. And for most Canadians, they don't know. GDP is broken down by sector, which I want to talk through with you today a little bit about the different sectors and what's going on, and really dive into it. But GDP, so how good a marker is it? How do they adjust it? Give me some thoughts on that.
So let's start off with the most basic transaction. I go to Tim Hortons and I buy an ice cap. It's a perfectly Canadian exercise. So when I spend $3.50 on the ice cap, GDP then would be $3.50. It's the value of the goods and services that were produced. But the other angle at which we could look at it is that $3.50 is somebody's income as well. When Tim Hortons receives the 350, they pay their workers some of the money, they pay their shareholders some of the money, they pay the landlord some of the money, they pay their suppliers some of the money. And so that $3.50 gets spread out among the various components of the economy in income form. But there's a third angle in which we could look at it, which is how much value is actually in the ice cap. So when you take those raw ingredients and you combine them together, Tim Hortons says, look, the ingredients only cost us $1, but we're selling it to you for $3.50. So Tim Hortons creates $2.50 of value added. But the story doesn't end there, because the $1 worth of ingredients that they bought from their suppliers were themselves rawer ingredients that maybe those suppliers bought for 25 cents from somebody else. So up the supply chain, somebody created 75 cents worth of value. The 25 cents were bought from somebody else, And if you go all the way back to the beginning, Everything comes from, take your pick, God, nature, whatever it is that you believe. But whoever was that provided it for free because it came out of the ground. So how much value added is in that $3.50 ice cap? $3.50. So what we do then when we calculate GDP is we go look at every transaction that took place within the last 3 months, last 12 months within Canada's borders, and we say how much was spent, how much was earned, how much value added was created. And all three of those things should give you the same number, 350. But the reason we would look at three different lenses is one showing who's spending within the economy, and that could be households, businesses, governments, or foreigners. Who's earning the money? That could be laborers or shareholders or government through the form of tax collection. Remember, there's a GST for all provinces in the country. And in terms of value added, which sectors are creating the value? And so that could be the consumer industry, or that could be the upstream wholesale industry, or that could be the raw materials industry. And so when we track it, the problem is when you start aggregating all of these transactions, it's pretty hard to see everything that's going on. And some transactions are not included, or some might be only included on one side because we can see that one side, but we can't see the other side. And so it's an imperfect measure, but I'm of the opinion that there's not a better calculation that's out there. So as long as this imperfect calculation is imperfectly calculated in a consistent way, then we have a rough idea as to what's going on in the economy. And the thing is that a lot of the stuff that matters to Canadians, clean air, clean water, good quality of living, the ability to enjoy leisure time, those things are highly correlated with GDP. So even if it's not perfectly calculated, if it's going up, there's a good indication that our standard of living is probably going up as well. So I don't think that it's the be all and end all of how to figure out what's going on in the macro economy. So that's also why I found it somewhat comical that we're debating about technical recessions. And really, you're missing the broader point. If that's the debate that you're having, then what does this mean then for Canadians and the stuff that really matters to them?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it also, is adjusted, I think in this case, for most measurements, for inflation and price indexing. There's a whole bunch of formulas, that you're probably way more familiar with than I am, that go in theories that go into the calculation of GDP so they can measure it through StatsCan every quarter. And the technical recession is the 2 quarters of negative growth. And I think what Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives latched on to right away is that it is. I took a look this morning as I was getting ready. I said, okay, which country in the G7 has a GDP that's closest to ours? Which, my name ends with an I, so I was interested. It came up Italy. And so I took a look and I'm like, okay, Italy has a $2.7 trillion GDP. They saw a 0.3 increase in GDP for the last quarter. So we are like, for technically, we are the only ones, in the negative. But to your point, people on a day-to-day basis, they're not concerned about it. They're concerned about what's going on in their life. But I wanted to break down. So then I dove in, and this is why I wanted to pick your brain on it. It's interesting. On a day-to-day basis, I wanted to kind of dissect the GDP a little. And I wanted to say, okay, let's take a look at what's happening inside the GDP for the last quarter. So agricultural, forestry, fishing, and hunting was significantly down, which I was a little shocked when it came out that way. And it's down because agricultural yields are down. So it looks like right now the farmers are having a little problem getting products to market. I guess, maybe it's costs, maybe it's, and that's an interesting one. Well, where mining and oil and gas are up, of course. So we're benefiting from, what's going on, unfortunately, in the Middle East right now.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems too with the agricultural sector and forestry and stuff like that is climate change is happening, and it's making it more and more unpredictable. I live some of the year in Halifax. I live most of the year in Calgary, and I teach in Montreal, so I get a chance to kind of see Western Canada, Atlantic Canada, and Central Canada. Uh, I can't tell you how many times I keep hearing on local forecasts that this is the once in a century storm or this is the once in a century weather event. Yet I seem to be hearing it on an almost annual basis. It kind of reminds me of Every time I hear like Leon's going out of business sale, it's our 17th annual going out of business sale. Well, if you're going out of business, how many times can you have a going out of business sale? So if you're having this once in a lifetime event, how many times can this happen in your lifetime? That makes it more difficult for farmers too, then, right? That because there is climate change that's happening, it's making the growing cycle more and more unpredictable. Or when you're getting those extreme weather events, whether it's plus 40, which now is not so shocking to hear in Canada. We're now saying wow to plus 50. You can imagine what that does to their product. But at the reverse end, minus 20, minus 30, and certainly for me out in Alberta, to hear a minus 30, minus 40 is not all that shocking either. So, if you get those unexpected cold snaps like we had in Canada, in fact, into May, that's the type of thing that can be really destructive too. So beyond just the Trump effect of tariffs and stuff, yeah, that's going to damage that industry in the first quarter of the year. From the oil and gas sector, of course, which is really important to us in Alberta, that's something that is determined by global forces entirely beyond Alberta's control. No matter how much Alberta wants to have control over its resource, at the end of the day, that price is determined by global events. So Alberta has no influence over the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, nor when it's going to open. And while the premier can make as many trips as she wants to Mar-a-Lago, thinking that somehow she can communicate with the Trump administration, she's not going to influence whether a ceasefire holds or not. So when you live and die by something that's not entirely within your control, you end up with this extreme volatility as well. So yes, it's up right now, and that probably saved Canada from an even worse fate from its GDP numbers. But let's not forget then that once that opening of the Strait of Hormuz comes, that oil price is probably going to go back down to around the $60, $70 range. And that's the type of thing then where we're going to have this conversation next quarter about how the bottom fell out of the mining sector or from the natural gas and oil sector too.
Yeah, it's interesting. And agriculture, I wanted to hit on because we got left out of the initial conversations on CUSMA, USMA, and they went to Mexico. They had their meetings in Mexico with Greer and Scheibaum, and they sat down. It wasn't a good meeting. I think it came out very rocky from the initial round. And one of the things that was thrown on the table really was oil and gas and resources versus agricultural. And for Mexicans, that's a huge issue. For us, it's going to be coming on the table too. So it's one of those ones I think we have to be watching and see how the Mexicans do on that front, because the Americans, whether it be the supply chain, whether it be milk and dairy, whether it be agricultural, that's one of the ones I think they're going to throw on the table big time to sort of get their way in that negotiation. The next one, which was down substantially, no surprise, which is very interesting, being here in Ontario and we're having a real tough time with construction and manufacturing. Both of those, definitely big time negative in the last quarter. We're not bouncing out. I know other parts of Canada we've done shows on are seeing better real estate numbers. We are just not getting through it very well. And that's starting to impact our manufacturing and everything going on. And we pretty much are just seeing a lot of people inventorying, the wholesale market expanding, the warehousing market expanding as people try to put goods into storage to try to weather out this whole thing. What are you seeing? You mentioned you're in Halifax and you're in Montreal and out west. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, so the construction market's a funny one because it really is a boom and bust sort of industry under normal circumstances, but it's a boom and bust industry that's always reactive. So I think that people in, say, the greater Toronto area will certainly appreciate that, when housing prices go sky high, as they will every decade or 20 years or so, this incentivizes then developers to start building housing. But by the time that they get that housing built, because there's time to get your permits and your construction in order and stuff like that, the bottom falls out of the market just as all of this inventory is coming on. And so it creates an even more abrupt decrease in the value of property. And then at some point it falls so low that somebody says, okay, this has gone low enough. This is a great time to start buying, and people start buying up all of that inventory. And then the cycle starts itself all over again. So it's the issue always in getting timing right. Now, if you're looking at residential construction, I was just in Toronto recently, and I took a day to walk all the way up from Union Station and go all the way up Yonge Street up north of Finch. And so along the way, I'm passing these areas on Bloor, these gigantic skyscrapers at 80, 90 floors high. That's not the same as building a residential neighborhood of single dwelling homes. Once you start building that 80 floor high rise, you're kind of committed to it. So no matter what the state of the cycle is, once that construction is done, do you have people to move in there? And if you don't, given that Canada's done a 180 on its immigration policy, there's a chance then that all of that stuff is going to sit idle and you have a massive problems on your hand. Commercial real estate is not all that different. When the price of oil goes sky high, everybody wants to build a nice, shiny new office tower in downtown Calgary. And then what happens is by the time that they get it built, the bottom's fallen out of the oil market and those offices sit empty until somebody says, hey, here's an opportunity. Let's start buying it up. And it starts itself all over again. So no surprises there. Now, as far as manufacturing in Ontario, there's an interesting stat that I've been trying to highlight for a while now, and I'm not sure that it's really gaining traction. But if you take a look at Canada's automobile production, it's about 50% down on where it was at the turn of the century. And so a lot of people will say, well, those are Trump's tariffs for you, and the idea that he wants to get that manufacturing back. No, this has been going on for 25 years now, and it's a steady, steady decline. Now, if you're Premier Ford and you say, you know what, I'm done supporting the auto industry. This thing's in terminal decline. It's reached a point of no return. The Americans aren't interested in electric vehicles. They're clearly not going to support our battery plants and things like that. If this thing goes south on us, what we should be doing right now is thinking about where are those workers going to go next and how do we help them train for the next manufacturing-based industry. He will not be in office past next week. So they're kind of committed to supporting an industry that personally I feel is in terminal decline. Now, where I told you where I live, I'll also tell you that I was born in Windsor and grew up in London. So I know the value of the 401 corridor and what the auto industry means to that area. But from an economic standpoint, it's not surprising that manufacturing is falling, especially in a broader sense. What's a lot of manufacturing in Canada for? It's to service the American market. And if the Americans are going to throw tariffs at us on aluminum and steel and the auto industry and trying to create that disruption, any business that's looking to build in Canada is going to say, why are we building for 40 million hosers if we're not going to have access to 350 million Americans? You know what we should do? We should just move to Detroit or to the Rust Belt in general, or even move to the American South where labor laws are not as strict or union demands aren't as great. And so we can get the same production at a lower cost. That's going to massively damage the manufacturing industry, because without access or unfettered access to the American market, this is always going to be trouble then for Canada.
Yeah, and I know the lot of discussion over the last few weeks about defense strategy in Ontario, and I think a lot of that we're not saying outwardly, but quite frankly, we're trying to figure out a way to transition a bunch of those jobs from auto into defense. And I know personally, when I was younger, I had family members who used to go up into London to build the heavy machinery and heavy tanks and armored cars up at the GM plant in London. And so I think they're looking at now and saying, okay, how do we take those defense dollars, retool these manufacturing plants? I know they know it's coming. It's we're starting to see the impacts of that. It's interesting because a couple of things that jumped out in this GDP numbers for this first quarter of 2026 that really hit me. One of them was the postal strike. So when people, you did a great analysis of Tim Hortons and the value add of a coffee and buying a coffee on the economy. But, we saw in the late 2025, a postal strike that went across Canada, and you saw it throughout. And that got resolved and people came back to work. So they saw the boost of that went into the numbers, and that helped a little bit. So, those are sort of the ways you see GDP go up and down. You really have to look at what's happening in the world, as well as the tech boom. And I think, Moshe, one of the things we're seeing in the United States right now, the United States is riding this crazy tech boom that's driving their GDP. So Donald Trump gets up and he says, we're doing so well. Our tech industry is driving, these multiples are so gigantic. We have a $32 trillion, GDP. We have a 1.6 first quarter expansion in GDP. But you really you break the numbers down sector by sector, like you and I are doing right now. And that tech boom in the States is really driving. it's driving us here. But when you look at the numbers, it's not as extreme.
Yeah, we saw in the last little while that the federal government has come out with an AI strategy, and it's merely a
Mm.
strategy. And I think it was criticized from a lot of sides, not just the conservatives, who will automatically criticize anything the liberals say, including whatever day of the week it is. But I think that there is this realization that we are well behind the curve when it comes to AI technology, and that's the adoption of it, let alone the creation of it, right? So beyond the fact that we're maybe not big content creators, we're also not using it when somebody else creates it for us. And I think that we need a bit of a deeper dive then on what exactly is the bottleneck here. The argument could be that Canadians are maybe a naturally more risk averse group than Americans, and we portray the Americans as a little bit of kind of the Wild West, and they think last and shoot first, and that sort of idea. But that also is maybe a cultural aspect that's holding us back. How many times do you hear these techs say, "I failed 5 times, but it was the sixth one that succeeded"? In Canada, the thought that, wait, you failed 5 times? How do you even get up in the morning to even try a sixth time, right? Like, we have this risk aversion that maybe exists within the Canadian psyche that, hey, if you're going to go into something like venture capital, tech industry, something where there's very, very high reward if you're willing to take on high risk, this might be one of those areas then where we need to rethink society. And some of that comes through things like the tax code. How do we deal with people who declare for bankruptcy, and do we continue to hold them to their debts even after they've passed through the bankruptcy process? Do we make it easy? Do we make it a scarlet letter that you have to wear the rest of your life, or is this a badge of honor and it's one of those kind of earning your stripes that, hey, the more times you fail, the more lauded you are? But beyond that, it's, are we doing in schools right by technology? So I often point out that I think you and I are certainly of an age where we probably spent our grade 1 experience learning how to write in script. And yet we would look at a younger generation now who don't know how to write their name, let alone take down notes using script. And it's because it's not taught anymore. That grade 1 time then can be taken up with something else. So what if we started teaching 6-year-olds how to use AI? And there's ways that you can use it responsibly, ways to use it irresponsibly, and I think that it's important that maybe they get educated in that. So by the time that they get out of school in 10 years, 15 years, they're not afraid of it. And it's one of those things that we saw when we were young, helping our parents to program the VCR, or how to adapt to CD players, that was nothing for us. Now we're probably more afraid of using social media, where we have to look at our own kids and say, hey, would you show me how to use this? If you train kids on how to use it properly, there's an opportunity here, but unfortunately, it might not be right now. And I think sometimes the government looks at the data. Oh my gosh, GDP contracted a tenth of a percentage point in the first quarter of 2026. What are we going to do? Don't worry about now. Look longer term. And I guess by way of some bad analogies I can offer you, when a kid learns to ride their bike, the biggest mistake that they do is they look at their handlebars. And a parent will always have to say, lift your head up, lift your head up. When you learn to skate, you look at your feet. And so the parent is saying, no, 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 look down the ice, look down the ice. What's the logic here? It's that if you can look further ahead, whatever's right in front of your feet will still be in front of your feet. But you're also going to be able to see longer term. And what is shown is that you're not riding all over the road, or you're not riding all over the ice in a crazed way, because you have that long term goal to keep you in place. So I think what's happening right now is that the political discourse is looking at our feet. We're looking at the negative 0.1 of a percentage point, rather than looking 10, 20, 30 years out. Where do we want to be? Where do we want to go? These are short-term phenomena. This is no different than a deer running out in front of your bicycle. Hey, you might hit it, you might get steamrolled by it, or you might be able to work your way around it. It happens. You can't prepare for every eventuality, but keep your eyes on the long-term prize, and you're going to have a much greater experience for it.
Yeah, no, no, good advice, and definitely, I lived in the States for 12 years. I mentioned that in some of the shows, and it's interesting because you do make a good point. People can go bankrupt in New York and reappear in California and be huge successes. You see people all the time. I had businesses throughout the United States, and I run across different people in my time there. And it was amazing. They were doing great in certain states and not doing good in the other states, and they weren't afraid of it. Quite frankly, they would buy a plane, they would commute back and forth, they'd learn to fly. Americans are, definitely have a different risk tolerance when you look at it, and I think that's why, they're. It's almost. I think I was looking at the stats last week. It's crazy. It's something like 75 times more investment by the federal government in the United States into AI than what we're doing right now, and we just put another 2 billion into it. So that gives you, an indicator of where they're going. One of the last ones on the list of GDP before I jump into some other things I wanted to talk to you about today, warehousing. So I'm very interested in this one and your thoughts on this. We are warehousing. So as far as warehousing and wholesaling, we are in transportation. We seem to be a logistical hub now. And I know this is something I'm a little concerned about as we go through this, because I've done a couple geopolitical shows, and I'm saying to people, I really would watch how this war is going to turn out. I'd really watch a few things before I double down in warehousing and logistics right now, because the shipping lanes, how the world's going to go. In Canada, especially in different parts of Canada, we went crazy from a warehousing logistics perspective. It continues to be a huge growth segment of our GDP. I'm just wondering, again, when is that going to satiate? Because we're seeing some of these things level out. We're seeing manufacturing level out. Your good points on auto. Okay, how much more? You're starting to see as you travel through Ontario now. I know you see a ton of leasing signs. So before, and my wife's in real estate. On Friday, there was a ton of commercial real estate dropped into the market. She came home and she said to me, "Wow, what a day!" She said, like it was hundreds of new properties from the commercial real estate market just dropped onto market. I'm like, oh, I wonder what prompted that. And was it a banking? Was it their concern about interest rates and what's going to happen with interest rates and inflation? But something triggered a bunch of leasing in the commercial real estate world. So, any thoughts on where we're going on that front and its impacts on GDP?
There is an opportunity here. I think we just need to be cautious. And having just said that we're too cautious, maybe as a country, here I am saying we need to be cautious. If if I ask people, what is Canada famous for making? There's always somebody who jokes and says something like hockey players, and fine. But if we kind of dig past that, what Canada is very famous for making is a lot of stuff related to natural resources, right? Forestry, oil, gas, mining, aluminum, steel, fisheries. And when I push and say, why do you think that is? The comeback is, well, it's all around us. Canada is this vast country that's got water on three sides of it, three major oceans in the north and the east and the west. So one of the things that we learned over time is how to harness what's around us. And so part of what makes us great at these things is that we have to be great at these things because they're always there. And so I come back to my initial point that, the person who says hockey players, even there, why are we so great at making hockey players? Well, because winter is the best 8 months of the year in Canada. So you better learn how to harness the winter for your enjoyment too. And so winter type sports that involve using the outdoor environment is probably going to be something that we're good at as well. And so to tie it then to warehousing and logistics, Canada is this vast country. It's over 6,000 kilometers driving from Halifax to Vancouver. And within that 6,000 kilometers, and I'm not even talking then about south to north, uh, we're probably 80% concentrated in 10 cities. I'm not going to list them off, but start in Vancouver and end in Halifax.
Yeah.
80% of Canadians live in 10 cities. You better be pretty good at how to get goods from point A to point B. And so beyond just, hey, we built a Trans-Canada Highway or we built the CN rail line, fantastic. But we have to be good at how to get things from A to B. And so warehousing and logistics are probably going to be something that we're naturally good at. Now, the thing is that over the last 60, 70 years, a lot of that we built up was not with this east-west thought in mind, but north-south, beginning with the Auto Pact in the 60s and working its way into the original, US-Canada free trade agreement, which became the NAFTA agreement and has since evolved then by bringing in Mexico, we've always been thinking north-south. How do we get things from here into Detroit, down the I-75 corridor, down the I-95 corridor? How do we get things down the I-5 corridor? And so a lot of what we built up then is with that in mind. The last 18 months have really highlighted that, wait a second, we also need to be thinking about east-west. And we've seen our prime minister racing around the world trying to come up with trade deals that will allow us to then push beyond just east-west being Vancouver and Halifax, but east-west meaning Asia and Europe as well. So, warehousing and logistics is not necessarily going to be the most important industry in Canada, but it's certainly something that is going to become increasingly important. We're always going to have to deal with the US. It doesn't matter what the free trade negotiations produce in the next 6 months. They're the largest economy in the world and they're in our backyard. We're always going to have a connection to them. So thinking about what do we want this industry to look like, and not necessarily having state-run decisions guidelining everything, but merely the idea of laying down the train tracks so that the train can freely move along those tracks is an important idea. So I think that, yes, it's an important sector. It's a little studied sector. And we kind of went alphabetically through some of these things, but it's also the one that kind of came near the end, in part because it's not the one that grabs the headlines, but it really is important and something we need to think about.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. GDP. So before we kind of go to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, I find it interesting how we started off the show and we talk about the 2 quarters of negative growth, but we don't talk about why. So we have these conversations, which I think is really important. So the expanding our conversation into a more fulsome conversation when we report on it, when people talk about it in the news, I think it's really important because we should be now starting to break down those sectors and figure out what the long-term strategy is by sector and have a discussion so people get on board. So they're not panicking, like you said, about, okay, we're going into technical recession. Things are changing. We know that the US, the tariffs, all our trade is changing. The world is changing. So having that discussion and getting people on board to why, I think it's super important. And it was interesting. It came out at the same, and sometimes in politics and life, it's just luck. Luck plays a lot and everything. But they put the grocery and essentials benefit out on June 7th. They did the report on GDP. Then we had the jobs report come out. And a lot of things were hitting the ground at the same time, which caused, I think, people to panic a little. At the same time, the parliamentary budget officer, Annette Ryan, the new one, came out and downgraded her growth projections and her increased her deficit projections for the country, which I think caused some challenges. So a lot of things hit the plate, in a short period of time. But it is interesting. So she came out and said, growth projections are going to scale down from 1.7 to 1.1% for 2026. And you know what, based on the expenditures that the government's making now, based on the programs, given what they're being impacted by, we're going to see a deficit go up from 66 billion to 72 billion. And then people are like, oh my goodness, more deficits, things. But, all those things said, she doesn't come out and start talking, which I think is something I harp about on every show, is productivity. So we don't talk about, okay, fine, all those things are happening, but what he's doing, and I think what he's not getting any credit for, and I know it's a difficult job because you're not going to see the impacts for quite some time. He's trying to figure out ways to get investment because the only way to get our productivity back going again, which I think is a much better marker of measuring how we're doing than GDP, but that's my opinion, is looking at the real output per hour worked. And when we look at the real output per hour worked, we're seeing the same thing. We're seeing a decrease in last quarter of 0.5%. Our business labor productivity is going down. It has been going down for a while, but our hours worked are going up, and our costs per hour is going up. So we're seeing a real unfortunate impact of, you have things like the union contracts being negotiated. You have which I did a show on it about minimum wage increases. versus what other countries do. I have a whole theory on that. I won't get into it with you another show, maybe if you have time. But I got into it and said, I don't like it, quite frankly. I don't like it for a number of reasons because to me, it stymies growth. But, we see all those things culminating, but our productivity is not going up. And I know he's trying to get programs in place, whether it be mining, all the sectors. That's what we should be talking about. I think right now, rather than talking about GDP and technical recessions, we should be focusing on how do we make our different industries more productive so we can sell abroad, so we can do those things. Give me your thoughts on that, and anything you have on the budget.
So for anybody who's just listening and not watching, as soon as you said productivity, I've had a smile on my face, and it hasn't left. You're absolutely right. And I have said through a variety of media channels that Canada's productivity is its greatest problem. And that has been a problem for 35 years now. This goes back to the Mulroney days. So for anybody who wants to lay this at the feet of one government or the other, it's left and right have been neglecting it. And I'll tell you
That's right.
that I agree with you. That is Canada's biggest problem. I heard Mark Carney mention it once during the federal election campaign. He was the only leader that mentioned it. And since then, it hasn't been mentioned. Fine, he's looking to try and create these programs to help boost productivity. But he needs to get that word into people's lips so that they understand just how important it is. I'll give you some basic facts. The labor productivity in Canada as a percentage of the US productivity number was about 90%, maybe a little bit more in the 1980s. It's now around 65% of the US figure. And for anybody who says that's because Americans are a bunch of workaholics, no, not true. The American productivity number has gone up slightly over the last 35 years, but not substantially enough to suggest that it's they're distorting the number and Canada's just along for the ride. It's the other way around. We've completely gone off the deep end. I'm going to offer a different reason for why that is. And it is something that the federal government can address and really should address. And that is industry is awash in a lack of competition in this country. And that lack of competition is destroying Canada. So you and I could probably spend the rest of this show trying to create an alphabet of industries that are not competitive in Canada. I will start though. I'll give you airlines, banks, cell phone service providers, donut shops, food services, grocery stores, gas stations, media, telecommunications, and we can go from there. The word in economics that we would use is Canada is awash in oligopoly. Most people might be familiar with monopoly. They might be familiar with oligarchy. This is the combination of those two ideas. So an oligopoly is where the industry is controlled by a handful of firms. So there's 6 big banks, there's 3 big airlines, there's 2 big donut shops. And what happens is when you don't have competition, your workers become lazy. Now, be careful. I'm not saying Canadians are lazy. It's that workers become lazy because as owners of businesses, if I don't always get up worried about I'm going to lose my customers because somebody's going to come along with how to build a better mousetrap, then I become complacent. And so I don't make sure that my workers have the best capital, the best technology, the best workspace. I don't allow them to become their best selves. So what happens then? When my workers show up and ask for a raise, I'm going to say, listen, inflation in this country is pretty low and stable. It's around 1 to 3%. So I'm willing to give you a 1 to 3% raise, but that's about it. If you want more than that, then you need to up your game. You need to be more productive. Now, if you can up your game 1 or 2 percentage points, then I don't mind tacking on an extra 1-2 percentage points to your pay because you're working harder for me. But the workers' pushback is going to be, but I'm not in a position to be able to work harder. You haven't given me the tools to be able to work harder. So the employer just shrugs and says, sorry, then that's the way it goes. But even worse, I'm telling you that productivity has been falling in this country. So when the worker comes and says, I want a 2% raise, the employer says, look, I'd give you 2%, but you're working 1% less hard. So in fact, I'm not giving you 2, I'm only going to give you 1. I'm clawing back some of that. And guess what? You lose purchasing power. And so on a year-to-year basis, you might not notice it, but accumulated over decades, it's really become apparent that we have clearly fallen behind, not just the Americans, but fallen behind where we could be because of this productivity problem. Now, I'll even tell you why some of this happened. It used to be that a lot of econ grads would go off and work at the Competition Bureau in Ottawa. And a lot of what they did was they would review mergers, and they would basically provide recommendations whether to allow mergers to go ahead or not. You're old enough that you remember that the big six banks wanted to merge their way down to the big four. Paul Martin, who was the finance minister for Jean Chrétien at the time, said, not on my watch, that's not happening, right? So that was a situation where mergers were not seen to be in the Canadian interest. It used to be that if you were going to approve a merger, you had to show overwhelmingly that this would be good for the, I'm sorry, you had to show overwhelmingly that it would be bad for the consumer, um, or otherwise the merger would not be allowed through. It changed over time, though, that instead of we will start from the position that mergers are not good unless you can conclusively convince me of it, it's now that mergers will go ahead and unless you can conclusively convince me not to go ahead with it.
Yeah.
So all of these mergers happened basically over increasing governments where we now find there's no competition. If the government really wants to create an ability to increase productivity, you need to allow competition to thrive. And unfortunately, that means opening up a lot of cosseted industries to foreign competition. Doesn't mean they'll come, but at least allowing them to come will be an option. And so anybody who gets on an Air Canada jet in the future, when they say proud member of the Star Alliance, makes me want to tear my hair out, because what that means is you've sewn up competition in essentially into an alliance that removes competition. So I'm paying $100, $200 more for every flight that I take because I don't have KLM, Air France, Lufthansa to compete for my business.
Yeah. No, no. You know, having lived around the world and seen the world, you see a different, and you see countries that have actually taken the exact opposite stance of as we have. They've gone in and they've opened up markets, whether it be financial markets, i.e., banks. And they've opened it up to private sector because then they get more small business lending, for example. Then they get more entrepreneurs. Then they get more productivity. How we think what we're doing is working really it drives me nuts, because I look at it and I think if we have to look at our productivity conundrum right now and start to figure out strategies to fix it. And otherwise, where's the capital investment going to come? It's going to come back into those oligopolies, as you mentioned, and it's going to just create the same outcome that we have now. So it is a real challenge. And I think, quite frankly, as we look at GDP, we look at productivity, we got to focus more on the productivity side. You know, thank you. We have a show coming up on Wednesday. Before you go, I just want to highlight, and it's on FIFA. And I know you do a lot of work. You do a lot of work, not only from an economics perspective, but you do a lot of work in the sports, gaming. Tell us a little bit about sort of, you know, what you do day to day as far as research.
So it's funny. I always tell people that economics has universal appeal, right? What time you got up in the morning is an economics decision. If you're married or not, that's an economics decision. If you're religious or not, that's an economics decision. Well, guess what? Sports is filled with economics decisions. So I'm a sports fan. I will tell you, I'm going to watch the World Cup. I was a former season ticket holder with the Buffalo Sabres, and I love the Buffalo Bills. And, you know, like I'm really into sports. But in sports economics, one of the things that we do is we say, look, the decision to try hard or not is an economics decision. If you want your star player to work harder, that requires effort, and effort is painful for that person. So unless you compensate them with a higher salary or a greater chance of a trophy or something, then you're probably not going to get them to want to work harder. If you want to build a stadium, then there's costs involved, of course, in building the stadium, but there better be benefits on the other side as well. So if we're going to host the World Cup, we have to lay out huge amounts of money. Will we get that money back? Why is it that the Toronto Maple Leafs cannot win a Stanley Cup for 60 years? Is it that they are cursed? Or is it that there's an ownership group that says, wait a second, I'm actually more profitable merely making the playoffs and being eliminated in the first round than winning a Stanley Cup. And so I'm perfectly fine then making sure that my players and coaches are hamstrung where they cannot succeed because I, as the owner, don't want them to see. And that's like a startling realization for a sports fan to hear that, wait a second, are you telling me there's a whole bunch of decisions that are going on that are economics based? Yes, all the way from the boardroom down to the field itself. And so part of what we do then is we take a look at how do we model this, and can we use our models to try and predict what we think is going to happen. Now, it's not going to help you win in Vegas. Don't think for a second that I'm fully loaded because I know who's going to win the Stanley Cup or who's going to win the World Series in the fall. But what we do is we say that, look, people respond to incentives. And so much in the same way, what's the incentive of getting up at 7 o'clock versus 7:15 is an economics decision. Whether we should host a large scale event like the Olympics or the World Cup, or whether we should pay that lockdown left winger an extra $1 million a year, or whether we should be sticking our kids into soccer or finding some other sport for them to participate in. It's all an economics decision. So there is an appeal then for what I do as an economist to something that I love. And so, when we talk about that, we're going to be able to see how the economics decisions might be affecting what we're seeing then as fans or as taxpayers that have to pay for these decisions.
Oh, that's amazing. I look forward to it. So everyone, tune in, and I'll see you in a few days.
Awesome. Thanks so much.